It's a new edition, and you know what that means? New codexes. Codices? Books. In this review, I'm going to cover the Necrons. I'll be following up this video, hopefully sometime soon, with the Space Marine Codex, as that book also came out at the same time. So, Necrons. This edition gave the Necrons a bit of a shake-up, introducing some new mechanics and reworking some old ones. So before we dive into this review, let's go over some of the mechanics and rules the Necrons have that may help you understand the Necrons. There should be a timestamp in the video timeline and on the screen that will let you skip straight to the unit review if that's the only thing you want to see. The Necron subfaction is the first big change that got made. Instead of only having one trait like a lot of factions in 8th, especially early on in the edition, they have been upgraded to having 2 traits each. Some of these traits have changed from the previous editions though. Of these traits, the ones that stand out to me are Novok with their more consistent charges and generally strong melee, Mefrit with their bonus AP and range increase, and finally Nilak, which gives you objectives secured on all your units and doubles the effectiveness of your already objective securing units and ignores AP -1. Choosing any from those 3 is a pretty good start. Considering the power of the Necrons and their generally expensive units, I'd favour Nilak to ensure that you're always getting the advantage on any objectives you sit on. You'll be sacrificing a fair amount of damage to do this, so don't be surprised if you're getting a bit outgunned on objectives. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Nephrex stratagem, which allows you to give deep strike to any non-vehicle, non-monster units. Furthermore, there is the ability to make custom dynasties where you choose circumstances of awakening and a dynastic trait, which there are some good options of. The only one that stands out to me is Radwreathed, which reduces the toughness of all units in engagement range of any units that have the dynasty keyword. Alright, mechanics. Necrons have about 4 major mechanics. We'll go over from the least complicated to most. Firstly, there's Living Metal, which makes every unit with the ability restore 1 wound at the start of the command phase. This applies to nearly every multi-wound Necron unit in the Codex. Next mechanic is Dimensional Translocation, which is just a deep strike. Drop 9 inches from the enemy in the reinforcement step of the movement phase. Pretty simple stuff. Next mechanic is Reanimation Protocols. This has been changed from last edition, so be careful. This triggers after the enemy has shot or meleeed a model with the ability to death. If the unit is wiped, of course you don't get to reanimate. You then roll a number of dice equal to the number of wounds of the models in the unit that were slain in that particular round of attacks. On a 5-up, the dice roll succeeds and you place them to one side. If the number of 5-up dice is greater than or equal to the number of wounds of one of the models that were killed, you can return one of the models back on full wounds. You then remove the amount of successful dice equal to the wounds characteristic of the model you brought back. You repeat from after the dice roll until the number of successful dice is less than the wounds characteristics of any model in that unit. You then discard the remaining dice. This means the Necrons are a bit more vulnerable to being chipped down, and also makes resurrection orbs much stronger. It makes it no longer the case where you have to wipe Necron units or most of them will be getting back up. Finally, there's the command protocols. These work by choosing 5 from a list of 6 different protocols and assigning them to each of the battle rounds. When the battle round begins, you choose 1 from the 2 options you were given for each protocol, then every character emits an aura of the effect that you have chosen. You require a noble character to be on the board to get this effect, so ensure at least one of them is in your army. Each of the main dynasties also get both effects from one of the command protocols, which is pretty neat. And the Zarak Dynasty Warlord trait means you only have to choose 4, as one of them gets to occur on 2 rounds. The only other mechanic that has really changed is Quantum Shielding, which instead of being a unique mechanic that meant you had to disassemble Necron vehicles with low damage weapons, now means you can no longer wound Necron vehicles in 1, 2 or 3 and they get a 5-up invulnerable save. Right, before we start, let's go over what the star ratings mean. A 1-star unit is an underpowered unit. It serves little to no purpose or is severely overcosted for what it does. A 2-star unit is a slightly underpowered unit. These units are either really situational, require extremely good rolls to be good, or just ousted by better units. 3 stars is an average unit. They do what they're supposed to do and generally are reasonably cost effective. 4 stars is a good unit. It can be the source of build arounds and will often be the main differences between your list and other people's lists if you're looking to build the strongest lists. Finally, 5 stars is for the strongest units. Either these units are essential to making your army work or stand above the rest of the units that fill a similar niche. Let's get started in 1 star with the Royal Warden. The Royal Warden doesn't really offer that much to your army. Admittedly, being able to fall back is quite nice, but Necrons have a variety of frontline units that are able to take charges and to charge enemy units, so the units in combat should be the ones you want in combat unless you've misplayed. Furthermore, Necrons don't get much from charging, like Space Marines do with their extra attack, so the whole breaking out of combat doesn't really seem worth paying 75 points. Plus, it only works on 1 unit within 9 inches, so it's not even an aura effect. To round this off, he's basically shooting an Immortal's weapon with 1 more damage, which is nice, especially seeing as there's so many multi-wound units running around, but the Immortals have the core keyword, which means they're getting hits off more reliably due to the buffs that are given to them. Next in 1 star is the Plasmancer. The Plasmancer carries a nice gun and has the ability to dish out some mortal wounds. However, in Necrons, you can just take some shards of the Catan to dish out mortal wounds if you're looking for mortal wounds. The Catans pull it off more reliably and do more damage. The only effect the Plasmancer can offer over the Catan is extending the aura of your command protocols, which I don't really think is worth the Plasmancer's cost, when you could just bring a different Cryptek that can offer more support. There's also the Cryptek Arcana that he can take, which is just more mortal wounds, but you can actually avoid them because it's telegraphed. Canoptek Reanimators are next. Getting +1 to your reanimation protocols is actually pretty valuable. So much so that I'd say that 30 points and the relic to get the improved Resurrection Orb is actually pretty good. So why is the Canoptek Reanimator all the way down here? First problem is you can only give the +1 to a specific unit, and then you are locked to that unit until your next command phase. Additionally, if you don't get first turn, any and all damage done to the units you'd be normally targeting don't have the +1 to their rolls. Furthermore, both you and your opponent know what units have been affected by the beam, so your opponent could just choose not to shoot at it. Lastly, and probably the biggest problem, is that you can just shoot or charge it and it will probably die due to its low number of wounds and mediocre toughness. If this thing had Get Down Sir, or if its beam was an aura, perhaps with a shorter range, it would probably be at least worth considering. Next up in 1 star is the Annihilation Barge. Since there was a nerf to Tesla, so it only triggers on an unmodified 6 rather than on a 6-up, there really isn't a lot of reason to care about Tesla weapons. The Quantum Shielding rework does favour the Annihilation Barge as it mitigates the low toughness of the barge, but the other vehicles with this rule can dish out a lot more damage than the Annihilation Barge. Keeping their 1 star spot is the Obelisk. Voted one of the worst, if not the worst unit of 8th, this unit hasn't done much to improve itself. It's still ridiculously overcosted, it still has very meager guns, and it still has a stupid and situational anti-flyer ability, albeit better than last edition. Overall, just very unimpressive. Lastly in 1 star is the Convergence of Dominion. Right, so it's a terrain piece. It is the quote-unquote cheapest way of spreading command protocols, plus it doesn't take up a HQ slot like most of the characters are required to spread the buff. Problem is the command protocols aren't exactly insane buffs, and they're usually handed out by characters you'll have near the units that want to be affected by it anyway. This terrain piece can defend itself and can move, which is a big upside considering those are the two things that I complain about terrain pieces usually, but you need to sacrifice a Cryptek's ability to shoot or charge, which usually isn't that big of a deal as you usually want them to hand out the buff and move on, but the Cryptek still provide the buff anyway, and the movement only happens on the next turn. Cryptek's, by the way, being any of the Mancer units like Plasmancer, Technomancer, so on and so forth. Starting 2 stars, we have Oricon the Diviner. As a more expensive, better at fighting Chronomancer, he isn't worth it. You generally don't really care if your support units are good at fighting because they should be, supporting your army. If you can get an imp powered off quickly, then sure, he's insanely beefy and he's pretty tanky with his 4-up invulnerable save, but you don't really care about your Crypteks getting into combat. Next up in 2 stars is Anrakir the Traveller. Anrakir is an overlord, a factionless overlord. Aside from that, he ends up being pretty expensive for not a lot extra. He can meme an enemy vehicle if he gets within 12 inches by forcing it to shoot one of its friends. He also gives +1 attack to any nearby core units, which only really benefits the Lich Guard. There are other ways of getting +1 attack, and admittedly stacking effects is a good thing, especially with attacks, but I think there's a point where you hit the oversaturation and you just end up overkilling anything you touch. Vargard Oberon moves up to 2 stars from last edition. He received a couple of buffs that make him, in my opinion, slightly more viable. He has a built-in Deep Strike and doesn't take up a detachment slot if you include him with Nemesis or Zandrek, which is important seeing as Necrons are really tight on HQ slots. This is good, seeing as you can place him aggressively with, say, Lich Guard, and use his teleport ability so he can swoop back to Nemesis or Zandrek if he's in danger. He also carries the Lore buff, which is simply just a reroll hit roll of 1. At the end of the day though, Vargard Oberon is still an expensive Lord, and if you're looking to unleash a ton of damage with a character, there are better options out there. Hexmark Destroyers are 2 stars. They're a lot of pomp and not a lot of practicality. You might look at the ability to shoot 12 times from a single model and think it's absolutely insane, but when you break it down, there are so many multi-wound models now, which means you can't get the reliable 12 shots off, or you're against a Horde army where taking down 12 models won't even have made the Hexmark pay itself off. Deep Strike is always something I'll give bonus points to, and if you can get to backline infantry, say like orcs with looters, I think this unit has some slight purpose. I think it's almost entirely designed to counter orcs, seeing as it has high strength or low AP, which means it can just destroy the orcs t-shirt save. I will also note this thing has a very good Overwatch, having a 2-up to hit in Overwatch and rerolls its 1s, and also that it spreads the command aura for some reason. Time for probably my most controversial rating. In 2 stars I'm putting the Ophidian Destroyers. I say this because I think they are outclassed by the Skorpek Destroyers. You lose a point of toughness, a point in strength, and a point in save for 2 extra inches of movement, which isn't a lot considering as board sizes are small and Cryptek destroyers already have a decent movement speed. Deep Strike, which I'll give you is probably the best reason to take them. The low chance of getting extra hits off your Reap Blades, which is weird because it doesn't apply to the Cryptek despite the fact they have the weapon that the rule is named after, and then finally -1 to hit in melee. All in all, Crypteks are great at killing toughness 4 and 5, and Ophidians are great at killing toughness 4, albeit I think I'd rather have the Cryptek +1 to wound over everything else the Ophidians are offering. Next in 2 stars is the Triarch Praetorians. In isolation, these guys are good. They are tanky, mobile, and have a pretty good weapon with the Rod of Covenant. However, a lot of stuff that buffs Necrons is either tied to the dynasty or core keywords, including traits, stratagems, and other buffs. Praetorians are neither of these things, but Grueman, you might say, the Silent King buffs Praetorians, and yes indeed he does. But keeping those two together just to make the Praetorians stand out seems like a large commitment for not a ton of payout. I mean, it's enough payout to make the Praetorians 2 stars at least. Canoptic Spiders finish off the 2-star spot. Now I know there's a fair amount of hype around these guys as they went up to 6 wounds and got an extra attack, but actually went down in points from last edition, unlike pretty much every other unit in the game. Problem is, they were one of the worst units in the Necron's Codex last edition. Their abilities haven't changed from last edition, so denying Psychers, bringing back Scabs and repairing vehicles. And of those abilities, I'd still only really rate the Deny the Witch as the good one. Another change was made to the Spider that made their melee actually pretty good, although only hitting on a 4-up is kind of bad, and to actually improve that you need to sit a Technomancer nearby them, which is pretty impractical. In the end, I think if you're looking for a single model killing unit, you should probably go for a Cryptek Lord. Now we move on to 3 stars, starting off with Emotech the Stormlord. He's been knocked down from last edition, as it's now possible for any Overlord to give out 2 My Will Be Dones, with an upgrade. Furthermore, the Soutech Dynasty isn't that good of an option, with probably the weakest of the available faction traits, although they do have a very strong Warlord trait that allows them to generate extra command points on top of the one you get every turn. He still has a really good AoE ability, which is good for punishing turtling armies, and he does get extra command points as well, which is nice seeing as the Necrons have a decent selection of stratagems now. At the end of the day, if you're taking Soutech, you probably want to take Emotech, but Emotech I don't think is enough to make you want to take Soutech. Next up in 3 stars is Nemesaur Zandrek. Nemesaur Zandrek is pretty cool, as he gets the ability to deny a stratagem once per game. If you've played against Dark Eldar with their Agents of Vect ability, or a faction with a similar ability, it is incredibly powerful and very annoying. So being able to pull it off reliably once per game is very useful. Furthermore, Zandrek can increase the attacks, reroll charges, or improve the ballistic skill of a nearby core unit. He can choose the buff he gives actually, which is better than last edition where he couldn't, but you do have to beat or match the leadership of the unit on 3d6. Problem is you have to choose the unit you hand out the buff to before you roll, and one of the traits is useless for Lich Guard and the other 2 are useless on the other 4 core units. At the end of the day, Nemesaur Zandrek is an above average overlord with an above average cost. He is stuck in Soutech, and while he is great for Soutech, Soutech as a whole still aren't great. Warriors come in at 3 stars, bit of a downgrade from last edition. They are here purely because of the strength of Immortals. Warriors of course are still a solid option though. Toughness 4 and 4-up save is reasonably annoying to chew through, especially if they're relatively low point cost. With the ability to reroll 1s on their reanimation protocols, they also have an easier time getting back up after being shot. Furthermore, in the cases where units restore models to units, Warriors get D3 compared to the usual 1 that most units get. Both gun options for the Warriors are quite nice as well, because they now got an extra gun option that is a short-range anti-infantry with high AP weapon. At the end of the day, they aren't as tanky as Immortals, neither are either of the guns as good as the Gauss Carbine of the Immortals. Death marks are pretty good now. They can deep strike and fire their now heavy synaptic disintegrators to completely obliterate a character of your choice. The ups and downs of their guns are now that you can deploy them a lot further back, as you no longer need to get in rapid fire range to maximise their effectiveness, plus they now have AP on their weapons, which makes them even better at sniping characters, but this does come at a cost of -1 to hit when you deploy from deep strike or move, and you don't get as many mortal wounds from sniping as you have less shots overall. Admittedly, they are only 1 point more than an Immortal for the ability to snipe characters, and they are core units, which means they can benefit a lot from the Lord's reroll to 1. To tie them off, they still have the anti-deep strike ability, but now it's tied into a stratagem. But they don't have to be in deep strike to use it, they can still shoot at a unit that's come out of deep strike if they're in range of it. Next in 3 stars is Cryptek Destroyers. It's odd to me that most of the squad only hits at strength 5. It's also odd to me that the models are as small as they are. I thought they would be a lot bigger. Anyway, these destroyers are a pretty good Marine mincer. The 2 damage and good AP is pretty nice at slicing through the medium toughness and high saves. For a lot of the Xenos matchups, the 2 damage will be quite wasted, seeing as the damage does not spill over. Obviously, if Marines are in, then this unit does pretty well against them. Problem is, Necrons have a lot of ranged options to deal with Marines as well, and the synergy amongst destroyer cults is mostly limited to just rerolls of 1 to wound from the Destroyer Lord, which means that the core keyword synergy is probably better. The Cryptek plasma sight is pretty much a 15-point tax you apply to the melee destroyers to allow them to get more damage out. The unit itself is pretty useless, but the buff is pretty relevant, allowing you to wound more infantry, especially toughness 5 ones, more reliably. The unit itself is pretty useless, but the buff is pretty relevant, as it allows you to wound a lot of infantry, especially toughness 5 ones, more reliably. The buff also throws in an extra attack, which is a nice bonus. You can stack this on any destroyer cult unit. The Locust destroyers don't really get into melee though, so you don't really want to give them the buff. The Ophidian destroyers are a bit too fast for the plasma sight, and if it gets out of 6 inches, the plasma sight just keels over and dies. Apparently it has some serious abandonment issues. Though if you can get the buff off, it helps Ophidian destroyers quite a bit. The Cryptek and Locust Lords can actually make good use out of the plasma sight, but you always have that 1 in 6 chance of just killing him, and if you apply the buff to him every turn, you have a 60% chance of this happening on at least one turn. Now you can bring him back with the Resurrection Protocol stratagem, but that only triggers half the time. The units that make the most out of the plasma sight are probably the Cryptek destroyers. The extra strength helps them killing all the Gravis armor running around, but the 2 damage is kind of annoying to waste on 3 wound units, but the extra attack help makes up for that a bit. Aside from that, the Cryptek destroyers and the plasma sight basically go hand in hand, having the same movement speed as well. Do note that you have to charge the plasma sight in with the destroyers, because unless it's sitting next to another destroyer unit, it will die in the coherency step. Next is the Triarch Stalker, a pretty average anti-tank / anti-infantry option. The buff to quantum shielding helps the Stalker a bit. Problem with this guy over the dozen or so other anti-elite infantry or anti-tank options is the lack of the Dynasty keyword. If you want to choose this guy and you're struggling with weapon options, I'd recommend the Gauss cannons for Marines and Heat Rays for basically everything else. I do find it strange that the flamer weapons don't get a blast-like effect, considering the fact that the blast keyword is supposed to be a replacement for templates, but whatever. C'tans! Right, so C'tans have a bunch of powers, with each of the named C'tans having a power unique to them. Pretty much all C'tan powers just deal mortal wounds, with the advantage of them over something like Smite is that you can't just deny it like you can deny the Witch, and usually there's some sort of spillover damage or other effect. Seeing as you have to choose the powers from a list of 6, I might as well tell you what ones I think are best. Sky of Falling Stars is probably the best, given that you can be hitting units of larger than 5. If you can hit 3 units that are larger than 5, you'll be on average dealing 5 mortal wounds split amongst the units. Of course you can't guarantee that, especially if you're playing against a low model count army, so after that I'd recommend Transdimensional Thunderbolt, which does more mortal wounds for each nearby unit to the unit you target. If you can get at least one other unit hit by it, it does more than most of the powers on average. The last solid one is probably Cosmic Fire, which is dependent on whether you can get 2 or more units within 6 inches of that C'tan. But seeing as all the C'tan can tank pretty well and like to be in melee due to the lack of ranged weapons on all but one of them, you'll probably be reliably able to pull it off. After that, I'd stick with the standard Antimatter Meteor, which is probably the most boring of the C'tan powers, but it's still a solid mortal wound bomb. Of course, you're free to choose whatever you think is best, but I've got a table here doing some quick maths of the average mortal wound you'll be dealing with each of the different spells. As for why I started this tangent here, it's because the next unit in 3 stars is the Shard of the Deceiver. Being able to redeploy after the game has started is great, especially with the current deployment system. I would make the argument that this is probably the tankiest of the C'tan with the built-in -1 to hit, which is much more relevant than the Void Dragon's extra armor. Admittedly, all the C'tan are stupid tanky, only being able to take 3 damage every phase, and regenerating 1 wound at the start of every command phase. While it is possible to kill them on the first turn, there aren't exactly that many armies apart from very weird Craftworld builds and maybe Orcs if you bring enough weird boys that can do it reliably. In both of those cases though, you'd have to be positioning your C'tan pretty poorly for that to happen. So why does the Deceiver sit in 3 stars? Personally, I prefer what most of the other named C'tans offer. Even though its Cosmic Insanity is pretty good against low leadership units, it has such high variance that you might end up doing no damage at all. Plus, the low leadership units are usually fodder that you don't really care about being obliterated, and you can usually just shoot anyway. Finally, I think his Golden Fists are probably the weakest of the C'tan's melee options, which is something definitely to take into account. Following the Deceiver is the regular Transcendent C'tan. This is by default the weakest of the C'tan, being stuck with only 1 cast per turn. But it is possible to fix this issue with the personality system. The way this works is you either choose from a list of table of 6 options, or you roll 2d6 and take the options that relate to the dice rolls. Problem is you have to re-roll both the dice if you get a duplicate, even if you get one of the good traits. The good traits are Cosmic Tyrant, which gives you a second C'tan power cast, and Immune to Natural Law, which basically gives you quantum shielding. Untamed Power is also debatably good as well. A 1 and a 2 on 2 dice with no rerolls, and this C'tan is busted good. However, as that is basically impossible to get in every game, you're either stuck with choosing one good one, or rolling and praying you get at least one of the good ones. Though the melee on this guy is pretty good, made even better if you can get the Untamed Power trait. Canoptic Scarabs are next, a bit of a fall from last edition, but they fulfill a similar purpose at the end of the day. They can test the board early on and tie up enemy units, but with vehicles being able to shoot into combat, it's a little bit harder to tie enemy units up. Eating out of shooting is still nice though, especially if it's hitting a low value unit like the Canoptic Scarabs. The thing that pushes them down is they're still actually quite expensive for units that don't kill much and also die pretty easily. I will of course give a massive shout out to the Nylak Dynasty Scarabs that get objectives secured, which is very annoying for your opponent to deal with. Canoptic Wraiths are pretty meaty marine mincers with their strength 7 -2 AP, 2 damage weapons. They're losing a rating a bit due to the loss of their 3-up invulnerable save. It seems like Games Workshop is trying to eliminate 3-up invulnerable saves wherever they can, which is something I very much approve of, even if it comes at the cost of Wraiths being a little bit weaker. On the upside, they retain their ability to move through terrain, their high mobility, and the fact they're actually pretty tanky even without their 3-up invulnerable save. It's just they're now units that can either dish out more damage or tank better than the Wraiths can. Next in 3 stars is the Ghost Ark. It has the same amount of shots as a squad of 10 warriors for only 15 points more. Pretty funny considering the fact that it has +1 save, 4 more wounds, quantum shielding, and 2 toughness over 10 warriors. Now obviously you can't just replace your warriors with Ghost Arks because this thing is terrible at securing objectives, and if it gets charged or hit by multi-damage weapons, it'll just go splat. Plus warriors have reanimation protocols, which transitions nicely to me be able to talk about the Ghost Ark's ability. Repair Barge allows you to restore D3 warriors that have been lost from a squad. Additionally, this thing is a transport that can take up to 10 warriors, which is really nice for getting them up the board. This thing can only transport warriors or infantry characters, which does suck a little bit, but if you want a Cryptek party bus, I guess you can cram 10 of them inside the Ghost Ark. Realistically though, you really shouldn't bring this thing unless you're bringing it with warriors. The penultimate unit in 3 stars is the Tesseract Vault. This guy actually had a points cut for me. Unfortunately, it's only a handful of points from a very expensive model. Still, it has the most Catan powers of any Catan model, being able to cast 3 on its top profile. It is also very tanky, having 30 wounds to tune through, with a 4-up invulnerable save and a 2-up regular save. Unlike the other Catan though, there is no limit to the amount of wounds you can lose on a single turn, and also unlike other Catan, this guy's melee kinda blows. The Vault does carry a few Tesla spheres, which are the same ones that are on the Obelisk, and therefore you would be correct in assuming that they are useless. For a quarter of your army though, there are worse point investments that could be made, but this isn't the monster that some people abused earlier on in 8th. Right, last of 3 stars, the Silent King. So Mr. Zarek carries a selection of deadly weapons. Between him and his menhirs, which both hit on 2-ups, they have a good amount of high strength, high AP weapons. The menhirs actually have probably one of the best weapons, with a 36-inch weapon that does 6 damage. The melee is also nothing to scoff at, with Zarek hitting with a very strong selection of melee weapons, with most of them getting extra attacks and having a limit on the number of attacks they can have, equal to the extra attacks they're given. So you don't actually have to worry about what weapon to choose when attacking. He has a built-in Denial Witch, which is very good for keeping mortal wounds away from Zarek, as well as disrupting your enemy's army. He also has all the Overlord buffs and auras, and he gives 3 command points when you put him in your army, and he also have extra auras on top of that. Full rerolls to hit and wound on all core and Praetorian units, which is just a really good buff. Honestly, Zarek probably has the single best auras on a single unit, but he is in 3 stars for a reason. Firstly, he is a massive target. There is no reason your opponent can't just dump all that anti-tank into Zarek. All the models do have a 4-up invulnerable save, so it would be easy to kill, and the 26 wounds are a fair amount to chew through, but once your opponent does take him down, that is 450 points gone. You see, that wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for his bigger downside. The Silent King loses buffs and weapons when he takes damage. Firstly, when each menhir dies, and then at every bracket. The menhirs themselves only have 5 wounds, so a good anti-tank shot from, say, a melter gun can take one down in 1 hit. And for each menhir that dies, that's one of your best guns dying with it. Then upon hitting half his wounds, he loses his reroll to hit aura, which is the more important of the 2 auras, as the Zarek Dynasty already has a built-in wound reroll. Of course, you can take Zarek alongside any dynasty, seeing as his auras aren't specifically for Zarek Dynasty. At 4 wounds, Zarek loses his to wound aura, but at that point he's basically already dead. At the end of the day, there's quite a few ways to take down Zarek that are pretty point efficient. I do like the fact that he doesn't lose his weapon or ballistic skill as he degrades, but his number of attacks does get gimped as he loses both the extra attacks from his weapons, and his profile reduces his number of attacks as well. At least after he's dead, he's likely to make a big ol' explosion. I also am not a huge fan of the fact that he hogs your Warlord trait above literally any other unit you can take, but only a single CP to generate a new one. It's not the end of the world. Oh, it's halfway through the video. That means I have to beg for subscribers here. So if you'll look at these numbers that are on the screen, it'll show about only 15% of you guys are subscribed. I'd really appreciate it if you're enjoying this content to subscribe to this channel. All shilling aside though, I am really appreciating you guys watching these videos. So, let's get back to the review. Luminor Zuras is next, kicking off 4 stars. I like this guy in the last edition and I like him here. He's a beefed up Technomancer with the ability to bring back destroyed models twice per turn. That is, destroyed on the tabletop, not actually physically destroyed. Unfortunately, you can't do this multiple times to a single unit, so you'll need to keep him around at least 2 units to make good use of the Rites of Reanimation ability. The other big deal with Xerath is his Augmentation ability. This allows a core unit to be either given +1 strength, +1 toughness, or +1 ballistic skill for the rest of the game. This would be great if you could either give one unit multiple buffs, or if you could actually choose the buffs you were giving out, but alas you cannot. 2/3 of the time you're getting a buff that helps the unit, and it's only really with the Lich Guard that you're getting a completely useless buff if you happen to roll a 3 when trying to buff them. Unfortunately, due to the change in command reroll, you can't reroll that 3 into something more useful. Anyway, to round the discussion on Xerath off, he does have a very nice range, but anyway, to round the discussion on Xerath himself off, he has very nice ranged melee combat, with the melee weapon even granting an extra augmentation if you actually manage to kill a model. The only real downside is the expense of Xerath and the complete lack of invulnerable save on such a big target, though he can still be protected with the Cryptek buckets. There's so many long and complicated units that I'm glad I finally get to talk about Trazyn the Infinite next. You're paying the same points as a normal Overlord with War Scythe, and you get a slightly more survivable Overlord, but with a little bit less damage. You can get a free relic, which is pretty cool. He's not bound to a dynasty, but that also means he doesn't get any dynastic traits. All in all, he's not a must-take, but he's a pretty strong option. I will say, however, he is a must-take in Crusade armies, as he gives free relics to everyone. Alright, next in 4 stars is the Cryptek Lord. Senor Cryptek is basically the Necron Smash Captain. He has a really high strength, which complements his really strong melee weapon. He also has some anti-horde equipment with his Flensing Claw's extra attacks, and the Enigmatic Annihilator. Finally, he gives rerolls of 1 to wound not only himself, but also nearby Destroyer Cult units. Only problem is the limited HQ slots the Necrons have, and the best destroyers, in my opinion, being the Locust Destroyers. So the buff capabilities are going to be a bit of a waste, seeing as your Cryptek Lord will be up in melee, and your Locust Destroyers will not be. Honestly though, still a really good Smash Captain-like unit. Next in 4 stars is the Locust Lord. Similar to the Cryptek Lord, he's just a little cheaper for a little less melee strength. He's still a strong melee combatant though, giving him a War Scythe allow him to cut through most things in his path almost as well as a Cryptek Lord. I mean, you're getting what you pay for with this guy. It does annoy me that this guy doesn't carry a weapon that can keep him in range of the other Locust Destroyers while also still being able to shoot. At the end of the day though, you're saving 25 points, which can be valuable in an army, and if you just want the buff aura for your Destroyer Lord, then the Locust probably is the better option. Lords come in at 4 stars. The change from last edition kinda hurt these guys quite badly, no longer giving out the reroll of 1s to wound. With an aura, he instead only gives 1 reroll of 1 to hit to a unit. But he does give the movement aura that used to be tied into My Will Be Done, so that's nice. He's a reasonably good melee combatant, and he is the cheapest way of getting a Resurrection Orb into your army. Essentially what a Resurrection Orb does now is allows you to make Resurrection protocols for all fallen units rather than the ones that were just killed in combat. Add to this the relic that gives you +1 to the rolls, and you can easily bring back half a squad of Lich Guard warriors, Immortal Scarabs, or basically anything with a Resurrection protocols, which is basically every multi-model unit. Catacomb Command Barge has also been buffed up to 4 stars, so Overlords are good. Having a tankier Overlord is good. Having a tankier Overlord with extra guns is good. Problems comes when you have to pay the extra points for those bonuses. 50 extra points for the Catacomb Command Barge, which is quite taxing, especially seeing as your Overlord shouldn't be shot at too much, and you won't really be making much use of his extra movement and tankiness. Also, for some reason he can't take the Void Scythe. Next up are Flayed Ones, another reasonably simple unit. They have Deep Strike, a bit of AP, and are cheap by Necron standards. They can be taken in large squads, make good use of reanimation protocols, and also pair pretty well with Psychomancers by taking away 2 leadership of nearby enemy units. Furthermore, they have a 1 in 6 chance of generating an extra attack on top of their starting 3. Very good for mincing light infantry and moderately strong backline infantry. They're also pretty good if your opponent is teching against Necrons and expecting a ranged, tanky army instead of a large swarm of Flayed Ones. Crypto Thralls are also a 4-star unit. They're basically Lich Guard for Crypteks. They are easy to target and don't take too much to wipe, but any shots dumped into this 40-point unit is probably shots that aren't going into more important models. What's better about them is they don't actually take up a detachment slot and become pretty scary in melee, hitting with 6 strength 5 attacks on a 3-up. This does require them to be near a Cryptek, but if these buckets are anywhere but near your Crypteks, you're probably doing something severely wrong. Boom, another Catan, Shard of the Void Dragon. This guy just hates vehicles and anyone who drives them. Everything from his special Catan power, weapon, and his absorption ability, all targeted at killing or benefiting from the killing of vehicles. Admittedly, the anti-tank vehicle element of his weapons are just more consistent damage, but the Catan power doing D6 instead of D3 mortal wounds is very nice. Furthermore, that Catan power forces any vehicles with a degrading profile to act like it's on half the number of wounds for the purposes of reading the profile. Basically, it knocks it 1 profile down. To tie it all off, his Spear of the Void Dragon is just a good weapon, vehicle killing potential aside. Why isn't he 5 stars? It's his expense. I'm still not sure how prolific vehicles are going to be in 9th. Elite infantry still seems to be the way to go. Next in 4 stars are the Tomb Blades. They're basically very fast immortals. These guys do get to keep their fly word from 8th edition, unlike a lot of other hovering units. They can just breeze over terrain pieces. Another bonus is that you can get an extra point in their save to match the immortals, and also get a 5-up invulnerable save at the cost of 8 extra points per model. But you might just be best skipping the invulnerable save, as it saves you 5 points per model, which is probably worth it. There is also the option to take a cover ignoring upgrade if you don't take the invulnerable save, which is up to you whether or not you think is worth it. Oh, as for their weapons though, I'll just leave them with their default guns. It's basically like a better Immortals Gauss Blaster. Locust Destroyers are also in 4 stars. They're pretty similar to last edition, although due to their high points cost they're quite difficult to bring. They are good anti-elite infantry slayers while also being elite infantry themselves. I will say that now that they're out of the fast attack slot, the Necron's attachments are a lot less confined, and usually picking one option over the other doesn't come down to, well, the best unit for this slot is X and Y, so I can't take this other very strong unit because X and Y is eating all the slots. I mean, the HQ slot is a little crowded right now, so the statement isn't entirely true, but it's not as egregious. Locust Heavy Destroyers are sort of an extension to the regular Locust Destroyers, but also have their own unit. They're a pretty decent anti-tank option, having either a sort of anti-everything gun with 3d3 shots and 1 damage, or a specific anti-tank gun with 1 shot and 3d3 damage. Obviously, the single shot gun has both more strength and AP, but the higher shot gun does come with blast, which Necrons are actually pretty short of. Neither of these cost any extra points in the Locust Heavy Destroyer squad, but each Heavy Destroyer does cost 70 points, which is a very large commitment. Try to keep them protected whilst blowing things up, because if your opponent can get shots on them, their 4 wounds won't be a lot to keep them protected. As such, I'd recommend sticking them in the regular Locust Destroyer squads, so the normal destroyers can soak up the shots for your heavy destroyers. Canoptic Doomstalkers are up next, and it's what happens when you slap the Doomsday Ark's cannon onto a big tall Canoptic Walker. Unfortunately, unlike their Doomsday Ark, this Canoptic Walker is stuck with a 4-up ballistic skill, and knocks a fair chunk out of the range. But hey, this still carries a huge anti-tank cannon, and while it might not be the easiest to get the high power shot off, the low power profile is still pretty strong. The 4-up invulnerable save is nice, and it also has a weird ability to borrow for the greater good from the Tau. Anyway, to fix the meager 4-up ballistic skill, you can park a Technomancer with the Canoptic Control Node to boost up that ballistic skill, which is a pretty big point tax, but if you can spread it between several Canoptic units, it's not as bad. Only reason this guy is in 4 stars is because I think the Doomsday Ark outclasses it as an anti-tank option. The Doom Scythe is also a similar deal to the Doomstalker. It's another anti-tank option competing with the Doomsday Ark. With this unit, you do get more consistent damage off the main gun, but the sidearms are way worse. The range is worse, and it is nowhere near as tanky as the Doomsday Ark, which gets quantum shielding. The range isn't that big of a deal, as the Doom Scythe is a flyer and can easily get in range to kill whatever it needs to kill. Not saying these guys are a bad option by any stretch of the imagination, I'd just say that this, the Doomstalker, and the Heavy Destroyer are all competing for the number 2 spot underneath the Doomsday Ark. Alright, a non-anti-tank option. The Night Scythe comes in at 4 stars, carrying 20 core infantry characters, or dynastic agents. This is one big transport. Being mobile is great for a transport as well, as it gets you to your destination faster, obviously. Dropping a big blob of Lich Guard with some supporting units is probably the sort of surprise your opponent won't be a big fan of. Plus, you can use the Night Scythe to beam in strategic reserves, which is very useful if you want to ensure that the units will not die in an exploding transport. This is the big problem with the Night Scythe though, because this oversized croissant does not come with much in the way of defense, much like the Doom Scythe. Alright, for the last unit in 4 stars, we have a somewhat surprising entry. The Monolith has had quite a few changes since last edition. Gaining 4 wounds and an extra save, the Monolith is a bit tankier than last edition. Furthermore, basically every weapon in this unit's arsenal has been changed. The Gauss Flux can now be swapped out for a Death Ray, which is an absolutely monstrous anti-tank weapon dealing consistent damage with high strength and good AP, though it does come at the cost of the number of shots and range. But at 20 points, for the 4 of them, I think you want to take the Death Rays over the Gauss Flux Arc. If you could split it 50-50, that would be the best option, but for some reason you cannot. The Particle Whip also got a rework, now having a random number of shots but more strength, AP, and a consistent 3 damage. To top it off, it has Blast, so if you're hitting a large enough squad, you'll be getting some consistency of the old Particle Whip back. Even the Portal of Exile got reworked into an auto-hitting melee weapon that just destroys most thing it touches. The final thing that was changed about the Monolith was that it was moved to the Lord of War slot. I don't think this is awful, seeing as there aren't that many dynastic traits you really need to give the Monolith. Perhaps the Mephrit one would be nice, but not mandatory. The big problem with the Monolith is that it is a command point vac. Firstly, the super heavy auxiliary detachment to take this, then the additional command points you have to pay to put things in strategic reserves, so they can be effectively transported by the Monolith. At least the Monolith has deep strikes, so the units you'll be transporting get into a good position very quickly. It's 5 stars time, and we begin with probably the centre of most armies with the Overlord. The Overlord is tanky, has good fighting capabilities, and basically always has to carry your Warlord traits. The good news is most of the Warlord traits are well suited for the Overlord, as they nearly all either help him fight or make him tank better. Now there's more to the Overlord than just fighting. He carries My Will Be Done, which adds 1 to the hit rolls of a single core unit. The core units are Warriors, Immortals, Lichguard, Deathmarks, and Toonblades. Most of the time My Will Be Done should be hitting Immortals and Lichguard though, although unfortunately the synergy with the Immortals Tesla has now gone. Rest in peace Exploding Dice on 5-up. The good news is, the other half of My Will Be Done has now been transformed into an aura that gives all nearby core units +1 to their movement, instead of the +1 to advance and charge like it was previously. I overall think this is a good change, as it helps the units that needed help with movement, instead of only being stuck with only one unit being able to move normally. Probably one of the more important things about Overlord is to upgrade them into Pharaons, which allows you to cast My Will Be Done twice, meaning you can have the Overlord babysit 2 units at a time instead of only 1. Unfortunately, you can only have one Overlord a Pharaon, and a Pharaon does have to be your Warlord. Still, the Overlords are very tanky, so it's not that much of a problem if he's a big target. Hey look, it's all the Crypteks in 5 stars. What do you mean Plasmancer? Literally never heard of one. Let's start with the Technomancer. This guy upgrades your Canoptic stuff and allows you to revive any core unit, the most expensive of which being the Lichguard. You can take a piece of Cryptek Arcana to make the Technomancer be able to bring back a Destroyer Cult, Canoptic or Triarch Praetorian unit once, but at best that's a value of plus 23 points when considering all the point values together, because you have to factor in the opportunity cost of not bringing back, say, a Lichguard. And that's only if you're hitting a heavy Destroyer. The Technomancer can also carry either a Canoptic Control Node or a Canoptic Cloak. The Control Node gives +1 to hit to Canoptic units with a 6-inch aura around him. If they opt for the Canoptic Cloak instead for admittedly much cheaper, they get the ability to repair D3 wounds back. There is another piece of Cryptek Arcana specifically for the Technomancer that allows you to give extra attacks to Canoptic units, so you probably want to stack that with your Control Node as well. Next to the Psychomancer, who is a good supporting unit for your melee armies. Nearby units lose a bit of leadership and take more casualties from combat attrition due to the Psychomancer reducing your roll by 1. The Psychomancer carries the ability to shut off objectives secured, halve advances and charges, deny the ability to do actions, or make you fight last and unable to overwatch/set defend. Admittedly, you do have to beat their leadership on 3d6 to get one of those effects off, but on average you should be able to beat most units on that roll. Now normally that wouldn't be enough to put it in 5 stars for me, probably a 4-star unit, but the Psychomancer also has the Atavindicator, which allows you to cast a targeted smite if you beat their leadership on 3d6, which is really good for sniping characters. The final Cryptek is the Chronomancer. This is probably my favourite one, giving out a 5-up invulnerable save and rerolls to charge. It used to be an aura effect similar to the Orc's custom force field, but now it's more like My Will Be Done, where you have to target a single unit. The big upside to this change is now that this single target ability has been given the ability to reroll to charge to any dynasty unit, so any unit that really wants to be getting into melee, you want to have a Chronomancer nearby to get the consistency of the charge off. Novox synergizes really well with the Chronomancer, giving +1 to charge and rerolls for some very consistent melee. The unique Cryptek Arcana for this guy isn't fantastic, but it does halve advances and charges on a single unit, which can be nice if your opponent is walking melee units towards you. I don't think this is worth 30 points though, especially seeing as your Chronomancer encourages you to be the one charging in. All Crypteks have the Dynastic Advisor's ability, which allows you to take 2 Crypteks in a single HQ detachment slot. This is great, seeing as there's a lot of good Cryptek options for Necrons to take, and the HQ slot is pretty competitive. Another thing to note about the Cryptek is they're not that great in combat, only having 1 attack and most of their guns being pretty weak. But they are support units, so you're getting what you're expecting. They're also pretty vulnerable, being picked off, as they don't really have that high of a save or an invulnerable save, with the exception of the Chronomancer, who has a 4-up invulnerable save. Immortals are the troop's choice for 5 stars. You get a point of toughness and an extra save over warriors for only 4 points more. They also carry better weapons with their Gauss blasters, which hit elite and regular infantry very hard. They don't get hit by blast weapons that hard due to their unit size, and their 1 wound actually makes reanimation protocols pretty good for them. I would advise taking these Shook troops in a maximum squad of 10 to maximize your efficiency of My Will Be Done and Resurrection protocols, while also not being hit by the worst of Blast. I wouldn't bother with Tesla anymore due to only triggering on unmodified 6s, and it has shorter range than the Gauss carbine. To put the final nail in the coffin, it costs more points than the Gauss as well. Next in 5 stars is probably the unit I've been most biased towards, the Lichguard. Now this unit is the linchpin of whether or not all this core synergy comes together. They have 2 options when it comes to weaponry. They have the Hold the Line style sword and board, or a murder fest with war scythes. Unfortunately you can't mix and match the squad because James Workshop said so. I think the strat is to go for war scythes though. Put these war size in the Noble, give them the Technomancer buff, the Overlord buff, the Lord buff, then drop the 1 CP on Blood Rights for the extra attack, 1 CP on Disruption Fields for the extra strength, and then the 1 CP for Eternal Protectors for an extra 1 attack, assuming you've charged in a Noble unit with them. This gives you a squad of 10 units doing 50 attacks, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, wounding most things on 3s or 2s, and basically forcing everything onto an invulnerable save, or it dies basically. Oh, and these attacks have 2 damage each. Now, this is a large point commitment, but between their 2 wounds, toughness 5, 3-up save, and 5-up invulnerable save now that you've given them the Technomancer buff, they should be fine, assuming they don't get gimped by something like a Judicar which forces them to fight last. You could alternatively go for Dispersion Shields, which act like Storm Shields by giving them a 2-up save and a 4-up invulnerable save, which I don't think you want to be wasting half your Technomancer's buff on. In fact, if you do choose the Sword and Shield route, I recommend using them to scream for your characters more than to dish out damage. This is because of their Guardian Protocol rule, which stops nearby infantry nobles from being targeted by anything. Unfortunately, this does not apply to Crypteks. All in all, I like Lich Guard. I think I might just be a little bit too biased towards them because I want them to be good. Feel free to berate me in the comments for being biased. Now here's a surprise to nobody, the Shard of the Nightbringer gets into 5 stars. He has a good Catan power that does above average damage for most of the Catan powers. He has the stupid tankiness of all the Catans. Oh, and he completely ignores invulnerable saves and any other wound mitigating mechanic. Now the invulnerable save ignoring is only on his strong attack, which, he gets to make 6 times, hitting on 2 up at strength 14, nothing major. It's not like it has minus 4 AP and D6 damage attached to it as well, so basically nothing gets a save and he can just delete most things he touches. Yeah, this guy's a monster in melee. Perhaps a bit overtuned. It is dumb that he costs the same as the other named Catan. If they weren't so annoying to kill, I'd probably rate this as a huge target that will just get focused off the board like Zaras. But basically no armies can kill a Catan in a single turn, so it will take a minimum of 4 phases to kill the Catan, assuming you get to shoot and fight him both times, due to the living metal rule, which means they get to regenerate one of their wounds back. And I can't think of that many armies that even want to be able to get both into melee with a Catan and also can shoot at them. All I know is I feel very sorry for Tau players. If I were to change one thing, it would be removing the living metal ability from the Catans because I think that just seems a little too strong. Alright, last unit. It's the Doomsday Arc. It retains all the power from last edition, but now has the extra benefit of having a massive upgrade to quantum shielding. This means it can hypothetically tank hits and have the things it wants to shoot at it first, then it can turn around and destroy them with high power shots. Even without that, the buff to vehicles that allows moving and firing with no penalty means you can keep them on the move and use the low power shots, which are still really good. This was meant to be the easier of the 2 new releases. Well, that's it for this Codex review though. Once again, if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and a subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer content. Hopefully, I'll have a stream ready on the first Wednesday after I upload this, or I should be streaming sometime in the afternoon for GMT. I'll be doing a Dawn of War 1 stream going through the campaign because I actually haven't had an opportunity to do that yet. So if you have any questions about the video or you just want to drop in and say hi or watch me play some Dawn of War 1, that would probably be the best time to reach me. I'm going to try and turn these streams into a more regular thing and a way that I can reach out to you guys without having to wait once every fortnight to upload a video. But we'll have to see, depends on schedule. So yeah, before I go, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for watching.